Welcome to Windows on the World. Tonight we're going to be talking about Atlantis, myth and possible reality, and how it is used to steer people all over the place and get lost in fantasy. It's a myth that has been repeated and repeated some more. It captures the imagination and has been used as a symbolic creation of the United States even. Manly P. Hall, obsessed with the teachings of the Theosophists and Freemasons, followed the New Atlantis in his Secret Destiny of America, which I read many years ago. Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, an unfinished novel published in 1626, referred to an island utopia known as Ben Salem, with an institution known as Solomon's House, which had been responsible for science and research. Of course, the Rosicrucians and all of these secret organisations, which are not secret of course because they're public, were into this mythology. Plato's story Atlantis, though, is symbolic. It is the rise and fall of civilization. It's the lost utopia. All this is very helpful for the story of Atlantis to be attached to globalist projects, like some follow the building of the Third Temple, for instance, to be their symbol of the new order. Whatever people believe or choose to attach to the story, though, Atlantis sank into the ocean. A big market has also sprung up around this unfinished story. It is entirely plausible and possible that a continent did sink. Recently, a huge tectonic plate, reportedly the size of a continent, was discovered wedged underneath two plates. I followed this story a while ago. I actually mentioned it. And all of this stuff now just gets lost. But this enduring story of Atlantis and the fantasies that go with it has endured because, of course, it's easy to make stuff up. Plato's Timaeus and Critias is said to represent the antagonistic sea power that besieged Athens, the centre of civilization, according to the narrative of the times. It is certainly a useful story to attach to an agenda. From the New Agers to the globalists, the Atlantis myth has consumed a lot of time and continues to do so. After it degenerated and its conquering armies were driven back, it was symbolic, again symbolic, of divine punishment. So, Atlantis, myth and probability is where we're going to go with this tonight. The whole Atlantis story fits so many narratives, but mainly an advanced civilization which has been identified as having huge knowledge, then degenerating and sinking into the sea. The legend of Atlantis, though, is an enduring one, invented by Plato 2,300 years ago. He claimed that this utopian civilization, which allegedly existed 9,000 years before his time, was punished by the gods for becoming selfish, greedy and immoral, and thus sunk into the seas. Which sea exactly is not known, and we will be broaching that subject a little later in the show. But when we talk of archetypes, this one is huge in the fantasy world of the New Age. Conversely, it is also used to describe what the architects of the Global Action Plan are up to. Madame Blavatsky told of how the Atlanteans settled in Egypt and built the pyramids. She had cut and pasted various works in Isis Unveiled, and some estimate it has 2,000 passages copied without giving anybody any credit. Reminds me of a few modern day grifters. But the idea that the Atlanteans actually did settle in Egypt is something that is going to be brought up a bit later again. And it goes along with the theories of Williams, Comins, Beaumont. Now, those influenced by Theosophy are also good at putting together a compilation of various unsubstantiated theories. The best known plagiarist, of course, is David Icke, heavily influenced by Theosophy and Alice Bailey, and now pushing simulation theory, which, in my opinion, is a convenient cop-out amongst the Galactic Federation of 5D cultists and those sort of people who are hanging on every fantasy which is peddled to them. The simulation theory has even more mileage, actually, than Atlantis. Nothing can be proved, so it's all a dream. A globalist cult called the wilderness of the mind or the lostness of the mind. Nothing means anything, and anything can mean whatever you want it to mean. However, the Atlantis story is an open book that anyone can take anywhere they want, and it requires absolutely no proof. It disappeared, and no one knows where it went. A book called Atlantis and Lemuria that I just found on Amazon, actually. It says, 60,000 years ago, 2 continents existed, each about 10 to 12% larger than Australia. One, Atlantis, was in the Atlantic Ocean, and the other, Lemuria, was in the Pacific. Why are they no longer there? Well, if they were found, the endless and pointless speculation and fantasy would have to end, so it's good for business if they are not found. These two things, simulation theory and Atlantis, when brought together by the New Age fantasists, end up in yet more throwing together of unfounded rubbish into yet another time-wasting dead end. Yes, I've been down there and had a look. But this is the entire purpose of most of it. If you want to see what drivel has been written around the Atlantis story, there's a good site actually called Atlantipedia.ie. And he brings up some good stuff amongst the most ludicrous stories that have been attached to Atlantis. Well, I've been studying, it says here, in a group called Lemuria, the continent of Mu. I just found this as well. I've been studying for the Lemuria talk on Saturday and looked up the Golden Age, which is the prophecy of these times, and here's what it said. A cycle of enlightenment, peace and harmony wherein the souls of mankind merge in the Christ flame for the fulfillment of the divine plan, as above, so below. Through the convergence of the etheric plane and sheath with the 3 lower vehicles of the earth body and her evolutions, the heavenly kingdom will come into manifestation on earth as it is even now in the etheric octave. I could go on with that and then go back into the idea of basically ushering in this golden age for us all, and it's all going to happen and everyone's going to get a payout. Great example of the brain death which has made up these stories over the last especially 30 years with the New Age, but of course obviously it goes back a long way. Yeah, it goes back 3,000 years, but these stories that this lost continent has spawned are more than numerous. Well, there are actually real sunken cities with pyramids, like the Yonaguni monument in Japan, off the coast of Japan. This is Japan's Atlantis, and it actually exists. It's off the coast of the Rikuku Islands, and it points to an ancient civilization submerged around 10,000 years ago. So that's one possible answer to the Atlantis myth. A pyramid-shaped structure, an arch, a staircase and other shapes complete with markings that could be ancient scripts have been identified, all hinting to this lost civilization, Yonaguni. And I've actually looked at that. It's very, very interesting, that. But these things do come up. I mean, obviously, these things are undersea because of past cataclysms. But in Egypt, there's one called the Theonis, Heracleion and Alexandria. These are 2 places. Alexandria's remains lie a few feet off the coast, while Theonis Heracleion rests a little farther off today's Alexandria. Both are spectacularly well preserved, considering the ruins are more than 2,000 years old and littered with various shipwrecks, dropped anchors, even lost and found recently gold treasure. Canals once separated temples and buildings of Theonis Heracleion, not unlike Venice, but now and how and why exactly the city became submerged is still a mystery. A lot of mysteries around, aren't there? More recently, a massive earthquake, 1692 actually, a massive earthquake followed by a tsunami killed 2,000 people and submerged the city of Port Royal in Jamaica. And it was once called the wickedest city on earth, and the city's sinking was deemed an act of God. Well, that's kind of in parallel with the Atlantis story, isn't it? But not quite as far back as we should be going. But today it is deemed one of the best preserved underwater cities in the world, with only a few items being removed and placed into various museums across Jamaica. Did you know that? I'd heard of that actually. But isn't it good to resurrect these things and put them into some kind of order? Got another one here. The 32,000-year-old underwater city of Duarca, or Gateway to Heaven, was discovered submerged 100 feet below the Gulf of Cambay in 1988. Ancient structures, pillars, grids of a city and ancient artefacts were found there. Well, some believe them to be at least 10,000 years old. There's a lot of this 10,000 years old coming in. And of course, that does actually align with the flood which Collins Beaumont talks about as the flood of Deucalion, Ogyges, all the same story, and of course the biblical flood. But others say they could be 5,000 years of age. This is this place, the city of Duarca. Yet others are sure that they date from the Middle Ages, so they can't make their minds up. Yet others claim that in 1473, Gujarat Sultan Mahmud Begada attacked the city and destroyed the Temple of Duarca. Either way, this is a true underwater city. I've been pulling these threads from everywhere. In 1967, an oceanographer discovered what looked like ancient ruins. A year later, a survey produced a plan of a prehistoric town which was thought to be Mycenaean, lying in 3 to 12 feet of water in the Peloponnese, it's in southwest Greece. Peloponnese. Pavlopetri, named after a nearby settlement, has since been touted as the oldest underwater city, dating to the Bronze Age and occupied from the 3rd millennium until 1100 BC. So we have a lot of candidates here for Atlantis. We've got another one here. Atlit Yam in Israel, a Neolithic settlement thought to be around 8,000 years old, is off the coast of Israel in the Mediterranean Sea. It was discovered in 1984 in 30 feet of water. There are buildings, graves and even the odd skeleton. There are also 7 megaliths arranged in a circle, described here as an underwater Stonehenge. It is believed that an earthquake and subsequent tsunami resulted in the settlement and ancient civilization becoming submerged. So, the theory of Atlantis is possible. And with so many real sunken and very ancient cities, there is plenty to look into without the fantasy world being brought in as well. Everyone can have a theory in this field, and it has been a useful part of the Golden Age story when everything was great and everyone was clever. The present is like a global Atlantis story. The decrease in intelligence and knowledge would actually hint at some end of this particular phase. So we are in the times when it could all happen again, if the myth and legend is in any way true or accurate. The chances of the Great Awakening happening are actually slipping further into the ocean of lost possibility, and the hopes for a new civilization are just about all there is to look forward to, and we've covered this in quite a few shows over the years. This idea that there needs to be a new branch of knowledge, that knowledge needs to survive, and those with the knowledge should actually keep it. I'm going to have a very quick break and I'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to Windows on the World. We have talked about the work of William Comyns Beaumont on numerous shows. Look up the article in the archive at windowsontheworld.net called Britain Shattered Isles. It will give you a brief synopsis of this theory that ancient Britain was a very advanced civilization, and there was a cataclysm there, and there was a lot of emigration across the continent of Europe from what was Britain. Britain was smashed apart from Scandinavia. It was part of a much bigger landmass. These are the theories of William Comyns Beaumont. And he, of course, had his take on the Atlantis story, which I found more compelling than any others after having looked into his extensive research on the subject. So, in the foreword to Britain, the Key to World History by William Comyns Beaumont, he actually puts down his ideas and indeed the facts surrounding his theories. He says, "I claimed on evidence produced that the supposedly lost island or drowned island continent, given the name of Atlantis by Plato, was not a mere romance or myth without substance, as is generally believed, but, on the contrary, it was a serious epitome of the most stupendous natural catastrophe which has ever affected the human race, both because of the magnitude and the severity of that visitation. I sought, moreover, to prove that the Atlantean calamity was a variation, in other words, of the flood of Noah, or, as the Greeks termed it, the deluge of Deucalion. For this purpose, evidence was derived from geographical, geological, astronomical, historical, and legendary sources to the effect that this major catastrophe afflicted northern and western Europe, mainly the Scandinavian lands, and beyond, all the British islands." Now, I've actually been looking into the work of Comyns Beaumont for quite a few years, and I was very sceptical to start with. Listeners to this show will know that we've covered a lot of his work, including the mysterious comet, which was the inciting incident for smashing apart the continent, which is now Britain and Scandinavia. And Comyns Beaumont maintains that there was an advanced civilization there well before the Romans, and that the biblical stories were actually centered on that landmass rather than the one in the Middle East. And it gives very compelling evidence for this. And it's something which I have come to accept as a probable reality, because Constantine and his mother Helena relocated Christianity to the Middle East in 325 AD. All that is known, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, etc. The site of that was actually put into history by Constantine's mother Helena, along with the two other churches. And he goes on to describe how present-day Jerusalem has no attributes of the stories which are in the Bible. So, getting back to what Beaumont says, he says, "I claimed, in fact, that the Atlantis island was no other than the British Isles, which bear the scars of that catastrophe to this day, that Atlantis was not permanently submerged, or even much of it, tremendous though the ultimate effects were." Now, this is interesting because we have, of course, Doggerland, which is off the coast of Scotland towards Scandinavia. And we know that that was once not submerged. It was a landmass. So there is a lot of credence to what Beaumont has to say. He says, "These islands, I showed, were the true Hesperides, or happy islands of yore, and are known to have been inhabited from the earliest Paleolithic or Stone Age onwards, and were the original domicile of the sons of Adam, who were the Titans or giants of classic fame, as well as being the Atlanteans of Plato." What I like about Beaumont is his detail. It is also backed up by meteorology as far as the inciting incident, the mysterious comet, is concerned. And that's a discipline which Beaumont was actually a leader in, meteorology. In fact, it didn't really exist before he got involved. He says, "My object, may I point out, was far greater than any mere academic effort, as some critics seem to imagine, to identify Atlantis. The disaster to Atlantis was only indirectly my theme, For what matters is what lay and still lies behind these facts. As facts I claim they are on the evidence. So he doesn't actually perpetuate the whole story from the Atlantis myth, but he draws parallels. It challenges the long accepted beliefs and dogma that the flood occurred in the Middle East, the supposedly original Chaldea, as to which incidentally, in spite of most careful investigations, there exists not a tittle of solid geographical or other evidence to support such a calamity in these regions. Well, this is a point which seems to escape most, which is why I have found it enormously interesting to look into, because most of the stuff that's out there on Atlantis I've been through and I've been looking at it a long time, and Comins Beaumont is about the only one to me that's credible. There are other theories, but they don't hold water for me. After having looked at Beaumont's theories, there is a wealth of evidence which he gives, and of which I still need to look into and verify. Of course, these sources are very difficult to verify because when there's been a cataclysm, there's no history. So he says, if correct, it must undermine the long accepted claims in relation to the lands we term Assyria, Egypt and Palestine, and I fear necessarily disputes the accuracy of many modernist interpretations from inscribed stones or papyri. In other words, we have been misled in these matters. We have covered how Constantine, of course, relocated Christianity with his mother Helena to the present-day Israel in 325 AD for ideological and also strategic reasons. So there was a very strong motive behind it. But the real motive, the real important idea of it all, is that it was relocated to cover up Britain's past. In other words, the true home of the Bible stories. And this sounds fantastical to so many people, and I don't blame you if you say that is ridiculous, because I thought it was ridiculous until I actually started looking into it, and I've looked into it a long time. It must logically signify that the segregation of Bible history as a thing apart from equivalent classic peoples has piled up completely false conceptions and valuations regarding the history of nations in past times. For example, I produce evidence to show that the Uranids of Crete were the equivalent of the people called Ur of the Chaldees in the book of Genesis, and that they dwelt not in the Orient or Mediterranean, but in the British Isles. If I prove correct in determining that such roads lead originally to that very ancient group of islands, the Shetland Orkneys, which straddle both Scandinavia and Britain, and that these were largely shattered by a violent natural catastrophe, well, we begin to perceive that the Gnostics and Curites of Crete, close kindred to the Chaldeans, were the sons of Seth or Sheth, the son of Adam, from whom apparently Shetland or Sethland acquired its name. In the regions of Caledonia, again, only a variation of Chaldea, those sons are probably the most ancient existing race of civilized man. Now, when we look at the history of Scotland, it has been really covered up, and there is something unique about Scotland within the whole history of the occult and the power structure of the world when we go back to the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry and we look at the history of Edinburgh. There's even a place called Little Egypt in Edinburgh, and of course there's a vast complex of tunnels. There are very, very many examples of extremely ancient history in that part of the world and across Britain, of course, but it does seem that Scotland, Edinburgh, could have been the real biblical Jerusalem. This is what Beaumont contends. So, the account of the last days of Atlantis is particularly valuable in research where we are told by Plato of a great war between the Atlanteans and their blood relatives who crossed the sea to reach them, a war lasting 13 years. And in the 14th year, when the Atlanteans were at the point of exhaustion, the city of Athens held out and defeated the enemy, but that all her warriors were drowned. Leaving aside the statement that the original Athens held out and alone defeated the invaders, it was, according to Plato, an Atlantean city situated on that island. Can we, however, synchronize Plato with the Bible references to the flood? The actual events of these dramatic 13 years, culminating in the Great Catastrophe, is the main theme of the book, Britain, the Key to World History. The true arena of this veiled yet historic event, as I endeavour to show, was the clash between nations known in the scriptures, including Gog and Magog, in which the invasion and slavery of other Bible peoples in the British Isles was the aim of the invaders. It culminated in extraordinary events in both the celestial spaces and on this unhappy earth. The final celestial disaster itself, as I described fully in my previous work, was on such an immense and concentrated scale and at the same time so irregular in its distribution that certain parts were destroyed or rendered uninhabitable for a long period, while others escaped with only comparative sufferings. Well, this does make sense, and after looking into it, it made even more sense that some areas would have indeed been untouched, because we do have evidence of a cataclysm in the northern part of Britain, and I looked into this a long time ago. In fact, something happened so suddenly that people were eating their dinners when it happened, because when people were found in these caves, I can't recall the exact location, but I can find out. I might look into it actually, because I've got the notes for all the Beaumont stuff in one folder here. But I remember discussing this with Ingrid McLean, and she sent me a lot of material about how these skeletons were found with half-eaten dinners. And something big had happened very, very quickly. So getting back to this, among its permanent effects were a variation in the Earth's axis, a lengthening of the solar year, and a consequent change in climate, whereby many nations in the north were forced to emigrate to obtain the means of subsistence. The myth of Phaeton describes how the ill-fated son of Helios, having stolen his father's steeds, tried to drive the chariot of the sun, but they bolted, whereby they threatened the earth's extinction, and Zeus, seeing the whole world was thus in imminent danger of destruction, and hurled Phaeton into the river Eridanus in the country of the Cimmerians. The explanation of the myth, as Plato himself records it, was the declination of celestial bodies. Actually, it would seem a twin or tandem comet, which struck the earth in the Cimmerian lands. The disastrous event is recorded on certain prehistoric Scottish zodiacs, as I showed in my previous work, in which the chariot of Phaeton is represented symbolically as wheels with a connecting axle, described by Scottish archaeologists as spectacles. They being naturally innocent of the intention of these stones, probably erected by the sons of Seth, or say the Chaldeans, in the Caledonian lands. The Cimmerians, in whose country this disaster happened, where flowed the river Eridanus, converts the mythological into the reality, says Beaumont. Britain's remote ancestors, through many centuries, erected an advanced civilization, built walled cities with towns, villages and ports, and sailed ocean-going ships, being a maritime people of great fame. Yes, there is an awful lot of history in a very small amount of space on the British Isles. And imagine if that had spread out and it was part of a much larger continent. Well, at an early date, he says, they mastered the science of how to manufacture bronze, designed weapons of warfare, and discovered the secret art of how to make and use firearms, otherwise known as black magic. Solomon built up his wealth and made the Israelites in his age the dominating people by his knowledge of magic, an art described by Josephus in these words: God also enabled him to learn that skill which expels demons, which is a skill useful and sanative to man. Well, this sort of knowledge would certainly be useful today in the Shattered Isles and, of course, everywhere else. Many immigrants found their way to the shores of the Mediterranean. Others went by the rivers Volga, Vistula, Dnieper and Dnester to the Crimea onwards into Asia Minor and thence to the Middle East, where we find Iraq, what appear to be, in Iraq, prehistoric Gothic inscriptions and occult designs. Well, there's been a lot found in Iraq. Obviously, we've got the whole Sumerian culture there, which goes back, they say, around 6,000 years. In a totally different direction across the North Atlantic, others made hazardous voyages and endured terrible privations in search of the sun and settled finally in America, mostly in Mexico, ages before Columbus discovered that continent. Many again went southwest into France, Spain and Portugal, hugging the Atlantic or migrating into North Africa. The land we now call Egypt was colonised then, or not much earlier, as shown by the astronomical evidence, and was originally peopled by Celts from the shores of Britain. The famous Egyptian Book of the Dead, influenced completely by the Epic of the Flood and composed in the name of Thoth or Hermes, in its ritual caused the souls of the dead to undergo a fanciful, final, gloomy pilgrimage to the sacred West. Indeed, I contend to the very scene of the former shambles in western Scotland, to the legendary Amenta, identified as the tiny island of Staffa near Iona in the Hebrides, where the wandering spirits were supposed to be judged by Osiris and were rewarded or consumed according to their lives on earth. Staffa lay in the very vortex of the greatest area of destruction at the time of the flood, water being but one element concerned, and later became the underworld of the Celts, as it was of the Hellenes. The flood, to the world generally a vague and nebulous tradition, really conceals the most appalling visitation mankind has ever experienced, as he may experience again. And that is the point, I think, that we are unaware, because of our short lives, of the inevitability of catastrophes in the future, maybe the near future. Okay, so let's carry on. The flood, to the world, generally a vague and nebulous tradition, really conceals the most appalling visitation mankind has ever experienced, as he may experience again, and its ravages in the British Isles and Scandinavian lands may be retraced to some considerable extent by the effects of what geologists term the drift age. It was no mere ice drift, it was sudden and terribly swift and violent. As I mentioned, Traces, the book Traces, that's Britain, the Key to World History, it traces the course of the 13 Years' War to its origin and source and elucidates the main arena of that dramatic conflict which stares us in the face in the scriptures if we know where to seek it. And he makes a very good presentation of this, and in The Great Deception he goes into the wars of the Jews, the Romans, how everything came out of this landmass. And having actually listened to it as well as read it, listening to it as an audio book actually conjures up pictures and you get in your mind where everything actually is. Otherwise, Beaumont's writing can be a little bit confusing. It takes a bit of getting used to. It took me quite a while to get used to it. But he says much attention has been directed to the lands of the West, mainly Somerset and Wiltshire, so important for various reasons, where I have claimed to identify sites known to readers of the scriptures, some of which survive and flourish to this day. The complete annihilation of cities by man is not so easy as it may seem. Jerusalem was said to be destroyed stone by Hadrian, and yet it still exists as a most important capital. I have found it advisable to devote the opening part to the consideration of Crete, the original Crete of Homer, because of its former great importance in the world of prehistory. The third section of the book, Britain, the Key to World History, describes in detail the scene and action of the 13 Years' War, and especially the part enacted by it in Jerusalem. When this is understood, it will be apparent how advanced, wealthy and highly civilised Britain was up to the Roman occupation, and probably during it, because, as an aside here, the Romans didn't actually conquer the whole of Britain. And of course, they're meant to have left by 400 AD, latest. And a lot of them, I think, left earlier. So, highly civilized Britain until the Roman occupation, and thereby to reflect how sad it is that Roman ignorance, tyranny, and censorship have for long centuries presented an utterly false impression of the courage, genius, and enterprise of the various states of the island they so coveted, robbed, and left in a condition of chaos. Well, this is very interesting as well in the respect that the Roman system was very, very good. They were very good at registering, they were very good at logging things, and of course they were very good at propaganda. So Roman history has to be taken with a pinch of salt. One further important point needs to be emphasised. The history of the civilised world in the past had little or nothing in common with Asia or Africa, and to get to the truth, we must raise the latitude of Europe to the lands mainly prominent, and even largely forget the Mediterranean Sea. The fair-haired race never had any racial connection with the Oriental peoples, the brown-skinned, dark-eyed and dark-haired races. The law of latitude forbids it, he says, just as the northern Aryans who invaded India and settled there as rulers and princes, despite the rigid law of caste they formulated in the course of a few generations, became absorbed in the native populations. This also happened in Mexico. Now this is interesting actually, because when I used to do interviews with people like Brian Forster and we looked at the red-haired people, the elongated skulls, the Paracas, they were said to be a seafaring race. So of course we had the Phoenicians, and then we get evidence all over the world and even in Australia of advanced civilizations actually going round the world and landing on different continents. So the migration patterns that we hear about, and especially the out of Africa theory, which has now been debunked, are just there to keep this theory in the minds of people so they don't look any further. That's my opinion on that. Let's see what else he says. Indeed, the world's civilization owes less than nothing to the Asiatic peoples. Even the Persians, who tyrannized for centuries over the West through treachery and the use of magic, can be traced to Russia and the Russians. Their characteristics throughout the centuries scarcely, if at all, changed other than in name, and who in their decadence were overthrown and driven back to their oriental bounds by Alexander the Great. We are told by historians that the Thracians disappeared from their lands by the Hellespont, and yet Herodotus says that they were the most powerful people in Europe who dissipated their strength by tribal quarrels. Well, of course, the Thracians have been completely written out of history, and there is very little trace in Central Eastern Europe of the Thracians at all. In fact, I don't think there is any real concrete evidence here that is left. And that's a very interesting point he brings up. But he says the Thracians were from the area of Scandinavia and were apparently settled from primeval times also in northern Scotland, close kindred of the Caledonians, who like them held wives in common, tattooed themselves, buried wives alive with their husbands, adored single combat, claimed descent from Hermes, worshipped Dionysus as their principal deity, raised mounds over the graves of their great chiefs, and held funeral games, all of which were also the characteristics of Odin's followers. It suffices to add that the country beyond their northern frontiers was uninhabitable by reason of the cold ice, the cold icy nature of its territory, for it lay under the Bear, or the North Pole. Take again the Trojans of classic fame. They were a brave and fine nation, advanced in civilization, who offered sacrifices to the dead of bowls of warm milk, goblets of wine, and also raised funeral mounds. Where do you find such mounds or barrows? Well, he says all over the Scandinavian lands and in Denmark as in Britain, but never in the Near East. I think he's talking about funeral mounds here solely, rather than the barrows, which are actually found across Europe. And I think they extend into parts of Asia too. It gets very complicated, all this, because I've studied it over the years. And what we're trying to do here is kind of put some kind of picture together. And I don't want to do it in a way that just pulls everything into a nice theory, as has been done so much in the past. So I'm not taking any of this with a pinch of salt, and I'm not taking any of it lightly either, because the elements of this story that I've covered in the past seem to absolutely make sense. Let's get back to what he says. The Trojans, after the great catastrophe, settled in great numbers in Britain, known as the Brigantes, whose history I trace, showing incidentally that Rome was founded by men of this very nation, and that they became the ruling people in Britain south of the Clyde and Forth. They never originated in Asia Minor, he says, but as will be seen from Ascania, Denmark and the Low Countries, from the regions later known as Frisia. The Macedonians, he says, well, Thracians, Cretans, Caledonians and Macedonians were all of one kindred, and they can be tracked down to their habitat in Scotland and Scandinavia, having many areas in England as well. What does Jerusalem appear to have been regarded as? He says, wait a minute, why does Jerusalem appear to have been regarded as in Illyria? It was not originally by the Adriatic Sea in the Mediterranean area. Transfer the Greek or Latin name to its British rendering Siloria, and we begin to recognise how the history of the Hebrews, the Iberes of Britain, was so largely played out in this island. How few appreciate the true story of the risings of the Silures against the Romans, and who fought with such fatal gallantry in a succession of wars opposing them, especially in the region south of the Forth. Yet thus shall we be getting nearer to the truth, he says. It will be apparent, in short, that Armageddon was the same event as the great catastrophe, and that Jerusalem lay and still stands a great and noble city in Britain. If this sounds a stupendous claim to make, it nevertheless fits in with the rest, he says. How many persons are aware that in AD 134 AD, after Hadrian had defeated the Jews under Bar Kokheba, the proclaimed Messiah, and had captured their stronghold of Bethars, he caused Jerusalem to be utterly destroyed and the land devastated, with the result that it was full of graves, the markets full of slaves, the towns given over to wolves and beasts. How many more realised that the site of Jerusalem was completely forgotten for over 200 years, until Constantine the Great caused it to be discovered for political motives in the present Palestine? The Palestine of today fails to correspond in any way to the Old Testament or come to that of the New. Daunt, in his work The Centre of Ancient Civilization, denied that Palestine was the biblical Holy Land for definite reasons, and these are the reasons. He claimed that the assumption is based on Hebrew documents alone, that the account of the Israelites being made slaves and fleeing from the Egyptian Pharaoh is not borne out by any other evidence but the contrary. Well, this is very true. No evidence of that has ever been shown. They try and find the odd thing which proves that someone might have been there, but nothing actually adds up. An exodus in the region of Sinai for 40 years with 600,000 warriors, well, even if something like that happened, there would have been nothing like that amount of people there, is an impossible story. Palestine, despite the accounts of its fertility and wealth, is perhaps the poorest land in West Asia apart from the deserts. Such a civilization with its many cities must have left its traces in the records of the neighbouring countries, but Palestine yields only the evidence derived from names that have been scattered industriously about the land in various later centuries. Well, that is a really good point. Such a good point about Philistinia and this whole area, because of course we're talking here about this whole area as being the land of Canaan and the Phoenicians coming out of there. Notwithstanding all this, not a single inscription has been found in Palestine which can be identified with the Hebrew kingdom. Jerusalem has failed to produce any trace of David and Solomon, any tablet or inscription or even foundation memorial. It might be added that the city entirely fails to conform topographically with its full descriptions given by Josephus and Nehemiah. The name of Europe was originally limited to a part of Western England, and continental Europe was Asia. To study a map of Europe so late as at the height of the Roman Empire, as prepared from the conventional acceptance of ancient geography, is a pathetic vision of emptiness, he adds. Except for southern Italy, Greece and Asia Minor, it contains Celtica, a vast and vague region stretching from the Atlantic to Venetia and above it, east of the Rhine to Germania, which stretches far to the east with a few vague names. Yeah, these old maps are fascinating. If you ever have a chance, get to look at these old maps with Germania on, and just have a look how big these regions actually were and how vague the whole landmass actually looks as far as what we see today, a collection of countries. He says Dacia, Moesia and Thrace occupy the Balkan lands, and the Ister is interpreted as the Danube, whereas it should be the Rhine. Similarly, as the Holtz River is placed in Asia Minor, but was the later Alvis or Albis, which is now the Elbe. So he's saying that the places which we know of today were very badly geographically placed at best. He says the answer lies probably in the fact that the historians of the past on whom we have to rely were mostly the Greeks, and more especially Herodotus. But these Greeks were themselves very circumscribed in their knowledge of the world. They were unacquainted with geography because foreign travel was not in their purview, and mostly they derived their knowledge from the Phoenicians, whose purpose was by no means necessarily served by widening Greek knowledge. They wrote their history from records or traditions, but their geography was vague. I first realised such shortcomings when I attempted to trace the detailed march of Xerxes from Persia to Athens along the accepted lines. But before long, I realised that this history simply could not possibly fit in with modern conceptions, and compelled me to follow out fresh investigations with, he says, surprising results. As far as the Bible geography is concerned, it appears that the main person responsible for its misinterpretation was Constantine the Great, who had definite motives for transferring the arena of Jewish history and that of Christ to another region altogether. He used Christianity as a valuable political asset, selected the East as his empire, and with the aid of Eusebius, Jerome and others, invented the present Palestine. If this be correct, the present-day Jews who make a historical claim to Palestine are utterly wide of the mark. Well, this is fascinating, I think, because what we're seeing now with what's going on in the land mass they now call Israel, the modern state of Israel, that's what it is, it's the state of Israel, it's a modern creation. What we're seeing here is this expansion into Palestine and the Palestinians being pushed out. This is not just a belief system that's in place here. More importantly, it's asset stripping, and that's what the globalists are good at. So when it runs along a biblical story, that is actually of a lot of use to them when they are using people as biological weapons, which seems to be happening with the people in present day Israel, the modern state of Israel. Anyway, let's get back to what Beaumont concludes. My aim throughout, as I hope the reader will appreciate, is to reconstruct the past history of the world in which it appears that Britain, or more properly the British Islands, played a prominent part. But one cannot correctly report history unless the geography is also accurate, and so the position of countries and historic cities becomes of major importance. In my former book, as I have in this, I have seemingly taken great liberties with geography, and I have to confess that in a subject so confusing and big, it is difficult to be always accurate. It means much research. Plato's famous Atlantis, as a matter of fact, knocks conventional geography and all the history or traditions attached to it sky high. Ignatius Donnelly, in his work Atlantis, said truly that the history of Atlantis is the key to Greek mythology, as indeed is the case. Yet that mythology all points unhesitatingly to the earliest civilizations as occurring in the Atlantic regions and not at all in the Mediterranean or in Asia Minor. Above all, the history of the Old Testament is the history of Atlantis. That these truths will be accepted is more than I would dare to believe. The world is misled today about the past, and the truth lies at the bottom of a very deep well. I can only presume to be a humble pioneer, but I hope that I may be able to hew a rough track which others may widen into a great artery for the enlightenment of future generations. That is a very good way of concluding this particular show. And this is fantastic because it will bring us in the next months ahead to other theories of Beaumont and how they tie into world history, along with other research that I've been doing over the years. And he makes a very good point here when he talks about a great artery for the enlightenment of future generations. We've talked so much about this, the lost order of knowledge, the resurrection of knowledge. Knowledge should be preserved, it should not be lost. And in order to actually know what is going on in the present, we have to take a deep look into history and question the narratives that we've been given. So these theories are actually very convincing, if a little bit mind-blowing for most. They will, of course, be derided by the narrow corridor of accepted opinion and the regulated mind traps of academia. Beaumont's Atlantis is probably the most interesting so far in the Atlantis story, and it actually starts to make sense. And it's not based on fantasy, as most of the stories that we have talked about in the early part of the show and how this has been used has been propagated into this myth, and we're trying to get away from the myth and into the reality. So that is the conclusion of this particular show. Do please help us out if you can. Join the £5 a month club, which helps to keep things running here at Windows Towers. And I'm very grateful to everyone who does support the show. We are getting out actually to a lot of different countries. That's what I like about this. The information I get back is invaluable. And for anyone who sends stuff in, please be aware that I keep all of it and I do look through it. I have batches of things which I look through at particular times. I've been really pleased with the information that comes in from the international listeners. That to me is fantastic, how a show, an internet radio show, can be picked up by thinking people in other countries, and they are helping me with this lifelong learning project. So until the next show on Windows on the World, check out the website. There's a wealth of information there. Do check out Britain Shattered Isles. And of course, the recent shows. I do live streams on YouTube, which then go to our Odyssey channel. Please subscribe on Odyssey and Spreaker. The links are on the homepage at windowsontheworld.net.